Okay. This probably doesn't look familiar to most of you, does it, this picture? But this is a large statue of Jesus Christ that is erected in the Andes Mountains, high at the top of the border between Argentina and Chile. And the statue is called Christ of the Andes. That's what it's called. And the statue symbolizes a pledge that was made between these two countries, between Argentina and Chile. And the leaders said, as long as the statue stands, there will be peace between Chile and Argentina. Well, shortly after the structure was erected, the Chileans were frustrated and they were mad. They felt that they had been slighted because the statue has its back turned towards Chile and the face of Jesus is facing towards Argentina. Thank you. And so tempers flared. There was war about to erupt out of this escalating conflict. And then it was a Chilean newspaper article that saved the day, that brought it all home. And so in an editorial that not only satisfied the people but made them laugh, he simply wrote this. He said, the statue of Christ faces Argentina because the people of Argentina need more watching over than the people of Chile. War ceased. Isn't it amazing how prone we are to conflict? Oh, we shudder, right? We can find excuses or reasons for conflict for just about anything. I mean, really, if we pick up the newspaper or our news on our phone or tablet every day, we are going to read right off the get-go about stories of conflict. It's everywhere. There's conflict among nations. There's conflict in our own nation over all kinds of things related to healthcare and finances and social policies and expectations and property taxes, whatever it is. Locally, there's conflict in our community, as there is in most other communities in our country, about how do we house and support those who are most vulnerable and unable to make it on their own. At work, conflict is kind of the norm, is it not? So much, in fact, that unions have to kind of be brought in, or at least the employees call for the union to come in and try to satisfy some of the conflict that is emerging. And the idea of unions are to de-escalate conflict, when in fact sometimes unions escalate the conflict. In churches, we're kind of no different. What are we called? We're often called the family of God. The family of God, the places and the houses of worship that should be most noted for the peace of Jesus Christ, and yet in which many of us are often churches marked by conflict. And think of those of us here in this little group called Terrace Alliance Church. There's about 50-ish or so of us saying things like, my theological viewpoint on this is right, and your viewpoint on that is wrong, right? The 50 people with 50 different preferences about styles of worship or about styles of leadership or opposing views on leadership or styles of programming, and everyone saying that their particular preference is actually God and the Holy Spirit inspired and everybody else's is wrong. And we too then read reports around the world about churches and denominations that are disputing and dividing. And those of us here at Terrace Alliance Church, who among us have not been a part of conflict, right? Even inside the walls of this place. So then we turn to James chapter 4, which we've just read, and observe that James not only raises the issue of what causes conflict, but then he answers the question by both giving the specific cause and the cure. Wow. Mr. Wisdom strikes again. How is it that he is so smart and knows these things that are about to happen? So let's spend some time this morning looking at James's assessment of conflict, and we'll review his explanation for the reasons of conflict, and then we're going to look at his prescription. He's kind of like a doctor, and he's going to write a prescription for us about managing conflict. So this is what we read in James chapter 4, verses 1 to 3. He says, "What is causing the quarrels and fights among you? Don't they come from the evil desires at war within you? You want what you do not have, and so you scheme and kill to get it. You are jealous with what others have, but you can't get it, and so you fight and wage war to take it away from them. And yet you still do not have what you want because you don't ask God for it. And even when you do ask, you don't get because your motives are all wrong. You want only what will give you pleasure." Well, James, he doesn't beat around the bush, does he? Boom. Hammer on the nail. Ouch. We get it. He says that conflict, what is it? It is about conflicting desires and preferences. That's all it is. It's not rocket science. It's about desires and preferences. Think about it. This is no different than a dude named Lucifer. Do you remember Lucifer? In heaven, we think that the first conflict was Adam and Eve. That was not the first conflict. The first conflict existed long before that in heaven. A holy place, a place where everything abounded in glory and worship to our great God, a place where the environment was sin-free, where freedom reigned. And yet with faulty motives, and to his demise, he was unceremoniously, along with 1/3 of the angels, booted from heaven. Gone. This, friends, took place in a holy place. Heaven. Look, when mine or your desires, or when my desires conflict with your desires, and when I don't get what I want from you, I power up, right? And then if I power up against you, guess what? Sparks are going to fly. Just look at the interrupted desires of pro-Palestinian protesters who try to power up to get their way. All it's doing is creating more division, more confusion, more conflict, because they believe that the only way to deal with this issue is to basically wipe Israel off the map. That's their end goal. So you and I often work, do we not, to try to find some external circumstance to which we can blame by going, "It's all your fault." But the truth of the matter is, James tells us that we need to look within ourselves for the source of conflict. You and I need to be very honest with yourself and ourselves, because conflict always emerges from within my own heart first. That's where conflict resides, in me. Now, we might think that we're godly people, followers of Jesus, and sure, we are. But at the same time, deep within each one of us is that old man, that old woman, that dark and selfish side that is embedded deeply within our heart. Now, selfishness, you know this, when we observe selfishness in somebody else, it's obvious, it's ugly. Ugh. But selfishness that is malignant and invisible and is a growing tumor inside of us, we can neatly surround it with all kinds of rationalizations and excuses and even spiritual blindness. AA calls it denial. So here James describes you and me as a people who want something, but we don't get it. And as a result, we are unhappy. Can you believe it? I'm putting my hope and my happiness in your hands? How stupid is that? Shame on me if I'm expecting you to somehow make me happy. But we do it. We do it all the time. And in turn, we become restless people. We become discontented, driven by pleasure. Driven by those things that we think will make us feel better. And the more we are driven by the pleasure principle, the more likely we are to become participants in quarreling and in fighting and in escalating conflict. You see, the fear of not getting what we want that we think we need from others leads us to do stupid things. And so in these verses here, there are 3 words that kind of jump out at me that describe the problem that we face. The first word is desire. What is causing the quarrels and fights among you? Do they not come from the evil desires at war within you? You want what you don't have, and so you scheme to kill and get it. You are jealous of what others have, but you can't get it. The word desire is also here the same word that is the word used for covet. And so some translations actually use that word here. So desire or covet. And desire or covet is often thought of and used primarily referring, a negative term, referring to lust, right? And so it can have a sexual connotation or orientation to it. So Jesus, in fact, said this in Matthew 5:28. He's warning people against looking at a woman to lust after her or to desire after her. But the very same word that Jesus used there is the same word that he used to describe something good and something godly. And Jesus in Luke 22, verse 15, used this word when he said, I have a desire to eat the Passover with my disciples before I suffer. And so the reality is we desire many, many things. Some are good, some not so good. And sometimes we receive what we desire, and sometimes we don't. The problem, though, is with strong desire, is when it leads us to do whatever we must do to get what we want, whether it's good or bad for us. We will do whatever it takes. You know that, don't you? I feel it all the time in my life. And sometimes I will ignore this and what it says to go after that which I think will actually bring me hope and happiness. And if we desire in such a way that we don't get what we want, we quarrel, we fight. In some cases, he tells us here that we even kill, both figuratively and literally, to get what it is that we want. When we do that, we are now truly far apart from God and his will and his desire for our lives, whereby we avoid the assembly instructions, this godly guidebook that he has given us to live a successful life. That's why we have his word. The second word that stands out for me is the word godlessness. Now, the word godless doesn't actually show up in the text, does it? But it is the thought behind what James says in verse 2. He said, the reason you don't have what you want is because you do not ask God for it. If you're like me, then all too often I don't ask for God's help. I act like he's unavailable or uninterested. I mean, God, do you really care? And so here I am, a child of God who's been promised that God hears and responds to my prayers. I know the promises. And I have the Holy Spirit who is ever present and who is anchored in my heart, who is present to hear and engage everything I do and say and think. But often I don't pray to him or draw on his support. And then not only do I avoid what the Holy Spirit may be prompting in me to do what is right, but then I don't follow the guidebook of what he says to do is right as well. And so James then tells me that some of what I desire may be good and legitimate and available to me, but I don't receive it because I don't ask God for it. But then sometimes I do ask, and then I don't get this instantaneous response from God, and he doesn't meet my expectations about what I think his answer should be to this problem in my life. And so James quickly points out, John, maybe the reason that you're not getting what you ask for is because you're not asking with the right motive. You're only asking for that which you think will give you pleasure and take the pressure off of your life. I may be asking God to be involved in my life and to distribute to me, kind of like Santa Claus, meet all my wants, all my desires, all my expectations. But the larger problem at work within me is that I'm not asking God to rework my desires so that they conform to his will. This is my desire, to honor you, Lord, with all my heart. We're going to sing that later. I honor you. Is that really the motivation? If that's the motivation in our heart, then we can begin to ask God in agreement with his desires that he's placed within us. And guess what? He will give it to us because it matches his will and his ordination, as it were, for my life. Many times our prayers can be utterly selfish. Sometimes it's been so called the kind of the name it and claim it approaches. I'm just going to name it and I'm going to call on it and I'm going to receive it. Greedy prayer is not mature prayer, nor is it godly. Now, you and I are entitled absolutely to bring our request to God, but our prayer has to be in the same spirit as was in the spirit of Jesus, who said what? Not my will, Father, but your will be done. That's what I want. That now forms my desire. My brother called me this week. He's about 10 years older than I am, and he's going through his second bout of cancer treatment. And he's got to go on the drugs, which just about killed him last time. Sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. So it's not looking good for him. And he said, John, I know I'm ready to meet Jesus. I don't really want to meet him yet in that way because I've got some earthly obligations that I need to fulfill, particularly with his wife who's not doing well either. But he said, I'm willing to submit my will to the will of Jesus. I will take the cancer treatments, but he said, I've asked the doctor to only give me half a dose. He said, the full dose I cannot handle. But he says, I know that unless God intervenes and takes it away, that his life on earth is probably fairly short. But he said, I'm okay with that. But he says, I'm not okay with it, but I'm okay with it. Because so there's this struggle in the spirit to release, right? But he said, I'm willing to do whatever the Lord wants and wills out of this that will ever bring him glory in the best way possible. It's hard sometimes, right? When we bring our request to God, we have an expectation, and it doesn't always come the way we want. But if our heart is aligned to his will, then we can be at peace. And no longer does that war fight within us. The third and final word is the word adultery. Whew. That's a strong word, isn't it? You adulterers, don't you realize that friendship with this world makes you an enemy of God? I say it again, if you want to be a friend of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God. Oh, how easily we become adulterous people. Now, I know that our immediate reaction, we hear that word, is always we tend to recoil, right? I hear the word adultery and go, there's this thing that just kind of jumps inside of me because the word most obviously suggests vivid pictures of sexual infidelity and adultery. And however, at the deepest level, James is talking about a spiritual adultery in which we are unfaithful to God. Throughout the Old Testament, God is seen as the husband of Israel and the nation his bride. In the New Testament imagery of that, Jesus is the bridegroom. The church, both men and women, are his bride. And when we are having an affair with the world, when we're having an affair with the systems of this world and its values, then we are being unfaithful to our heavenly spouse. And then James reminds us of a theme that is scattered throughout the Bible, and that is that God is a jealous God. He does not want to share us with the world. He's not willing to be a two-timer, as it were. And so he reacts with holy jealousy when we become enamored with the world and we set other gods before us. And so now we've explored and hopefully better understood the source of conflict. He says our conflict comes from the desires that battle in us. We're prone to selfishness, evil desire, and adultery. And then as a result, that orientation is going to create conflict between us and others and between us and God. It just is. So now an even more pressing question, though, becomes what's the cure for this thing? Can I actually get free from conflict and turmoil within my heart? Well, that picture might remind you of somebody, good old Charlie Brown. Some of you might recall the classic Peanuts situation. Charlie Brown and Lucy. It's an ongoing theme in their relationship. And Lucy would offer to hold the football while Charlie Brown kicked it. But from almost every time, he would run up to kick the ball and Lucy would pull it away and Charlie Brown would go whoop, boom, and fall flat on his back. So one day Lucy said, Charlie Brown, why don't you kick the football? And he said, no. He says, I'm not willing to do that anymore because I know what always happens. And as soon as he accuses Lucy of her past wrongs, she begins weeping. Oh, you're so right, Charlie Brown. I admit that in the past I've played cruel tricks on you, but I've seen the error of my ways. I've seen the hurt in your eyes. Won't you give this poor repentant girl another chance? And so Charlie Brown relents and he says, okay. And so he backs up to run and he begins running to go and kick the ball. And just as he's about to kick it, Lucy pulls the ball away once again and Charlie Brown ends up ka-thunk on his back. And so Lucy, as she is walking away, she comments to her friend and she says, unfortunately, recognizing your faults and actually changing your ways are two different things. I think we would all agree that recognizing the problem is only part of the solution. Doing something about it is actually hard and much more difficult. And so I believe that James now begins to prescribe 4 steps to deal with conflict effectively. So the first thing he says, that we need to humble ourselves, or the word is submit ourselves to God. He says, submit yourselves to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. The word submit is actually a military word that means to put in proper order or rank, or to subject yourself to somebody else, and then to obey them. I don't think too many soldiers actually like listening and responding to their sergeant or lieutenant or any other higher ranking officer to do the little peon jobs that they often are called on to do. But they do them. They submit, they obey. Why? Well, there's a consequence usually if they don't. And it's not fun. And so to submit is to humble. To submit is to yield ourselves to the will or to the authority of another. And in this context, to submit to God. And in submitting to God, we will then be able to obey the things that He is calling for in our lives and submit our desires to Him. So when we begin to find ourselves in conflict with others, we might want to fight. We might want to argue because our viewpoint is the only right one, is it not? And we want to prove a point, and we want to put a person in their place. After all, I am right, and you're not. But if we have put God in charge of our lives and are living under submission to His will, then His peace will rule in our heart. It just is. That's how He works. And if we can admit that we have conflicting drives in us that keep coming up, we have to then keep submitting them to God. And when we submit these conflicting desires to God, we then find strength to be more like God in our interactions with other people. You see, my happiness is not dependent on what God does or doesn't do for me, or what others do or don't do for me. You see, my happiness isn't even dependent on God. My joy comes when I submit to Him and fully embrace Him. And then when He calls me to do something, I can joyously do it because I know the reward of which He gives, the peace of God. That's what we want to reign in our heart, I believe. And so my happiness isn't dependent on external circumstances. To help when we submit to other people, yes, I might be conflicted with my wife or my kids or the boss at work, but as long as I'm keeping God centered and focused in my life, then I have the strength to address those things. And one of the things I know I need to address isn't the conflict between me or the expectations of me to someone or someone else to me. I have to look inside of me. What's going on, John? Why are you conflicted? David said, "Why art thou disquieted within me, O my soul?" Something's wrong. And it's not out there, it's in here. We need to understand that people with whom we may be conflicted are broken people just like us, who have been made in the image of God, and that person with whom I'm in conflict is actually God's tool to help me grow and develop and mature as a person of God. God knows what I need, and sometimes He allows those things into my life as much as I detest them and don't like them, but when I fall in submission, the peace of God begins to rule in my heart. Humble ourselves before God. The second thing he says, resist the devil. Resist the devil. Friends, if we have not submitted, first of all, ourselves to God, then it will do no good to try to resist the devil. It's got to start with our submission to God, then our resistance to the devil. If you try to resist the devil in the power of your own strength, schmuck, you're going to get taken out at the knees every time. And when we understand the reality of evil and the power of Satan, then we will begin to realize that he is actually a coward and that he runs from the strength of the Lord. And he might be a roaring lion in your face, but in the presence of Jesus, he is a whimpering, defeated, feral cat. He's got nothing. Roars don't mean. If he's roaring in your face, so what? He can't do anything to hurt you if you know that you're anchored, first of all, in Jesus. And so then the promise of Ephesians 6, which we won't get into today, it shows that we can actually be spiritually armed for the war against Satan and with God's army, whereby the evil one is defeated. It's, again, Paul lays that out, and it's fairly easy, fairly simple. Thirdly, so we need to submit to God, we need to resist the devil, and then he says you need to get close to God. Draw close to God and God will draw close to you. Isn't that an incredible promise? I love it. God has already drawn close to you. That's what this table is all about. He made the sacrifice already so that we could have a relationship with him. And now my job, as it were, as a follower of Jesus, is to submit and to resist and to draw close. Get close to him. How cool is that? Jesus, in fact, wants us to be so tightly bound with him and with others that he is involved in the detailed and the meticulous and even the most boring times in our life. He wants to be there. He wants to be a part of it all. He wants to hang out with you. That should bring you great hope and desire. He wants to hang out with you. And so the question is, how on earth do we draw close to God? And James actually gives us some ideas here. He says, first of all, wash up. In verse 8, clean up our hearts. And again, that's part of the work of the Holy Spirit, but we have to be in submission to that and remove the pollution and the moral filth and the ungodly attitudes and realign ourselves to the purposes and plans of God. And then we need to express remorse for our sin in verse 9. And then he says you need to humble yourselves. You need to bow down. You need to bend the knee. And that's hard for some of us because we so often want to be the ones who are in control. The Bible is filled with stories of people who were proud and self-sufficient, and they tried to exalt themselves above God. It began with Lucifer that we described earlier in heaven, and then Adam and Eve, and then Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar, and then Simon the sorcerer, just to name a few. But the Bible tells us that God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. And not just grace, but more grace and abundant grace and a grace that will never run out or dry up. And again, that is the essence of this table before us this morning. And then finally, the other part of the cure for conflict is we have to stop judging others. Brothers and sisters, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against a brother or sister or judges them speaks against the law and judges it. When you judge the law, you are not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you? Who are you to judge your neighbor? Conflict, where does it start? Conflict always starts in the heart. When formed by judgment about what we think others should or should not be doing. I can't say it any louder, friends. Stop it. Don't do it. Because it'll get you nowhere, but just wrapped up in more conflict. You see, when we set ourselves up as judge and jury, we are spiritually in trouble, and conflict is the unavoidable and inevitable result. It just is. You see, there's always a consequence to our actions. And James reminds us that God, he's the lawgiver, he's the judge, and so keep in mind who he is in all of this. And then he says we have no business judging our neighbor or speaking slanderously against him or her. Well, but we discovered a little while ago, didn't we, not a few Sundays ago, or last Sunday actually, it's easy to judge others. Judgment just kind of rolls out of our heart. And then the process, when we do it, somehow makes us feel bigger and makes us feel better. Friends, if you have to put others down in order to make yourself feel better, then you have lost your identity as a child of God. And you have lost sight of who is in rightful control of the universe. And guess what? It's not you and it's not me. James has previously instructed us on how to love our neighbor as ourselves. He called it the royal law. Remember? The royal law, James 2:8. So let's keep in mind who we are and who others are. Who are we? We're simply broken people made in the image of God who need his love and his grace, and we need to extend that same love and that same grace to others as well, even if we don't like them, even if we don't like what they do, even if we think they're wrong. If you don't get what you want, or if you don't get what you deserve, so what? What's the big freaking hairy deal anyways? Think about it, really. I love watching the show on TV called Crime Beat. I don't know if any of you watch that show, but I love Crime Beat on Global TV, because what they do is they extract stories of crime across Canada where the reporters actually go and so some of these cases are 10 years old or more, and so they do clips of the reporters and then people who are investigating and the police, and they're interviewing the police and all of that. So this week I saw an episode in which a man murdered his wife. And the show is going through all of the ins and outs of the trial and how they found him and all of that. But he's standing now before the judge. And 5 years after the fact, and he could not recount the argument that started the whole thing off in the first place. It had just escalated so bad and so out of control, he couldn't even remember how it started. My wife Jan, she's got this little quote or quip that she shares with people, and she shares with me. She says, it's not worth getting into a fight because 10 years from now, who cares? Who remembers? And so she said, if you think you're getting into a fight, think about, okay, 10 years from now, is this really going to matter? It ain't going to matter. It ain't going to matter. And so it's a good reminder, I think, for all of us. You see, God gives us more grace, and the humbler we become, the more grace we receive. And the more grace we receive, the more we should be in a place to extend it to others, even those who, as I said earlier, kind of maybe gear us the wrong way. So, what's our response to Jesus this morning? My assumption is that we all want to live at peace. Do you remember some of those beauty pageants from years gone by? And they would interview the various contestants and they would ask them to give a little snippet about what they want. And probably all of them would say, world peace. I want world peace, world peace. I think it's true. We want world peace. Not only out there in the external circumstances of Israel and Gaza and Niger and all other kinds of places around the world where there's conflict, but we want peace here, right? And we want peace here. I want you to turn to somebody and say, I want to live at peace with you. Go ahead. If we take seriously these 4 prescriptions that Dr. James has described here, we will then have discovered the antidote that destroys most relationships, both with God and with others. And so may God help us to realize these things and put them into practice. Friends, as we prepare to come to the table of the Lord this morning, we're going to sing a song to help us engage more fully in this practice. But you may be aware this morning that you need to make amends with somebody. There might be somebody that you've been in conflict that you're going, ooh, before I participate here, I better make sure things are right here. The Holy Spirit is here to help you do that. It's no shame. You can get up and move around and go and talk to somebody. Don't let bitterness eat your soul, because bitterness will destroy you. It'll take you out. Get out of the conflict that you may be in, and then receive the grace of communion that is before us today, because Jesus is here. He is the antidote for what ails you. And so we're going to sing, and then I'll come back and give us further instruction.